Hello and welcome to this edition of Peak Life. So, have you ever wondered how your street got its name? Well, we're going to learn a little bit about that process. We've got Tracy Bland here with us today. Tracy, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to learn about addressing.
Okay. Well,
Who knew that that was a job, right? I mean,
well, I did.
Tracy knew it was a
Yeah,
job because
yeah.
she's got it, sure. But it's one of those classic government positions that nobody thinks about until you have a question about it. Like
Right.
you're always kind of working in the background, working with developers, working throughout the city to get streets named, to get numbers out there. So let's jump right into it. We were talking before we started about a grid. So there is kind of a method to how you number and address streets in Chesapeake. So
Right.
let's start with the grid.
Okay, so at the Great Bridge, that's where the grid starts. If you go north on Battlefield Boulevard, it starts at 100 there and increases north. And on the south side of the bridge, of Battlefield South, it starts at 100 and increases going south. It also increases from 100 on either side of the street, east and west, from 100, and then the grid works out accordingly. And so depending on where that subdivision or of land is, where that falls in the grid will determine what range the streets get, when they're developed and addressed.
So you do a lot of work with the developers and you kind of give them a plan, like here are the numbers you can use?
Well, what we do is, if a subdivision is submitted and it goes through the Planning Commission, City Council process, once it's approved, they provide us with an overall plan. During that process, we also receive the street names and we check those against our streets database to make sure that it's not a duplicate street name or a sound-alike street name. And we also have some parameters where the name can only have but so many characters, and that's for the street sign, so that the font doesn't have to get smaller. So that's an emergency services thing. We don't want them to have a hard time reading the street sign.
Sure.
So there's a lot of things that we check for, and once it's approved, the addresses are assigned, and then they are also updated in our GIS address point layer. And all that information is sent out to a distribution list, which covers emergency services, schools, voter registrar, Verizon, 911. The list is kind of long, but we basically push those addresses out so that they can put those addresses in their database so that when services are requested, then they have that as a valid address.
So it actually does lead into a lot of different aspects of government. We got to make sure that our ambulance drivers can find the home, or public utilities can hook up to it if that's the case.
Or when they call to get their telephone service or their mail, or yeah.
So so this is like a question I personally have always had. When you're going down the street and it's say 450, and then it like jumps to 450, what would that be? 4? Because it's always evens and odds, right?
Right.
And then why?
Ideally.
Ideally, sure.
Ideally, yeah. I mean, the older stuff you're going to maybe find some inconsistencies there, but the new stuff, it depends on what side of the street, if you're on the northeast, south, or west, as whether you're odd or even. So that's something else that we check when we're doing addressing, is what side of the street are we on? Is it northeast, southwest?
So is there a reason why sometimes the number's skipped? Like on the same side?
We normally always skip 4 in residential. Now, if it's a townhouse development, then we may skip 2. It just depends on how many units are there, because you can run out of numbers in a certain range. I mean, you can go to the next range, but if it just depends on how the street is subdivided by other streets.
Okay.
So in industrial areas and commercial areas, we go 8, and that's because a lot of times a commercial site will have more than one building on it.
So you're leaving that
So we're
space.
leaving those, building those numbers in there in case they're needed.
Gotcha.
Later if they build something else.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the names themselves. Like that's the part that I'm sure you hear about the most. How did this street get named? How did that street get named? How often is there kind of like a historical or significant reason behind a street name, and can you name a few?
Probably in the last 5 years, we've kind of honed in on that. We really want to use history of the area or people for to preserve that history.
Yeah.
One that comes to mind is Moses Grandy Trail.
Mm-hmm.
And I really got into this one because the name came up, someone else suggested it, and I Googled him and read about him. He was a slave, one of the slaves that helped dig the canal.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of like a autobiography of his life. And he bought his freedom 3 times, only to, well, let's think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
He's working as a slave. He gets paid next to nothing. And he's having to pay back a portion of that to his masters to buy his freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And he would get just there, and then he was sold.
Yeah.
Only to do that 3 times. And it just talked about his family and how they got separated and everything. I'll never forget that. I was just like hooked.
And that street is going right next to the Dismal Swamp Canal.
Right.
So there's that connection.
Right. So I really, I was really happy that happened for that street.
Yeah.
A lot of times when there's road projects, we will look at that area for some historical meaning too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of.
Well, and sometimes, like you were saying, how developers will come to you. Sometimes they have a plan and a vision, or that they want their development to be called, oak something, and so everything's a tree, or you know.
Well, we have no more tree names available.
Really?
Yeah.
So trees were a popular street name.
I don't know what it is. It's just like that's a go-to, you know, and I always encourage them to be a little more creative with their street names. But they submit the names, we review them, and tell them whether or not they can use it, and make sure it meets the parameters of the standard operating procedures of addressing. So,
well, tell me about the operating procedures of addressing. So you really do have, there's like a lot of boundaries. People can't just throw out, I'm going to rename this street XYZ and have it go through.
There's procedures for that. We have renamed streets before, and it's, it's a process.
Yeah.
And everyone that touches that street has to agree to that, or it's not changed. But basically, this standard operating procedures for addressing was everything that I did from '96 until about 5 years ago.
Wow.
So we kind of extracted everything out of my brain and put it in a manual.
Good.
Things that I just did every day that wasn't documented.
Yeah.
So the next person that does my job will have a guide.
So that's kind of your baby.
Yeah.
It was your creation throughout all
Yeah, well,
this.
it was a group effort, definitely. Yeah, it was a group effort.
Do you ever get requests for street names, whether from developers or private or whoever, that are so off the wall, you're like, we can't do that?
Well, a lot of times I'll say, I don't know what that is, and I'll Google it and find out what the meaning is, because if I don't know what it is and it isn't something good, then that would, I want to make sure that it's good.
Yeah. So, let's see. What else do we need to talk about with addresses? This is neat.
Well, I think the main thing is maybe on the top of the list of the important things about addressing is that we communicate that with emergency services, and that they can rely on that number to be consistent with what's around it, and so that when someone calls 911,
and no duplicate numbers, right? Or no duplicate street name and number,
right?
How do you manage that?
Definitely no duplicate numbers on the same street, because then which one do you go to?
Right.
So with the big infill building that happened in Indian River, say the past 10 years, that was an issue because when those houses were built, they were built on 3 or 4 lots, and when they were addressed prior to the city becoming a city, they didn't leave any room in between the numbers, and so we did have a lot of address changes to do there, and it's not really hardly ever received very well. That I'm gonna, you've lived here 40 years, I'm going to change your address. So
you couldn't just do like 6A, 6B, 6C?
Well, at that time we couldn't do it because our technology wouldn't recognize
Oh.
that there's an A and a B, but now it does. And
Okay.
it kind of saved my life.
So yeah, so everything changes and evolves.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well,
So-
Tracy, I mean, this is really great stuff, and we're going to link everybody to that standard operating procedures so that they can just kind of have an idea. Because
Yeah.
again, like I mentioned, this is one of those things you don't realize there is so much thought put into.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here, Tracy.
All right. Thank you for having me.
That does it for this episode of Peak Life. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.